Good afternoon. In our last lecture together, we looked at three great Madonnas, seated Madonnas enthroned with the child and with angels. The last of those was by the famous Giotto. All three of them are together in the Uffizi in Florence. And we looked at Giotto's work in that single instance, and I said we would be turning to his most famous work, a cycle of paintings, today. The work that we're going to look at, you have to understand, is not in Tuscany, where Giotto was born, and I'll say a little more about his origins, but not in Florence or Tuscany, but rather in the north east corner of Italy, near the coast and quite near to Venice, Padua. Padua was a very important city in Italy already in the 12th and 13th century. It was the seat of a famous university, still is, and therefore it was a very cultured area. There was also a good deal of trading money in Padua, which explains the commission that we're going to be talking about. Giotto worked on what we know today, almost universally, we call it the Arena Chapel, beginning about 1303. The Arena Chapel was the palace chapel for the Scrovegni family palace. You're looking at an image of the chapel. The palace no longer exists. The palace and chapel were built on the site of an ancient Roman amphitheater, and that is why it has the nickname and has had Arena Chapel. The palace followed the outlines of the old arena. When you look at this chapel, all that remains of the chapel, you have no idea, no hint of what lies within. You look at it and you see a solid, austere exterior, a simple doorway, a tripart window above, and on the right side, the south side, you see a series of tall windows. A very simple structure altogether, but one which reflects the power and wealth of the family. I'll be saying more about the Scrovegni, that's S-C-R-O-V-E-G-N-I, the Scrovegni Chapel, its proper name, and the family in a few moments. Let me show you what lies within. When you walk in, you see a not huge, I'll give you the measurements in a moment, but a large chapel, completely covered with frescoes on the walls. The ceiling is also frescoed or painted, but with the blue that simply symbolizes heaven, the heavens above us. Otherwise, the decoration is confined to the lateral walls and to the wall at the altar end, and also the wall of the entrance, the door wall, which will be the last thing that we'll look at in the two lectures that we're going to spend talking about the Arena Chapel. Here on these walls is one of the supreme achievements of Western European art. A fresco cycle of 38 large narrative scenes on the walls and a huge Last Judgment on the entrance wall. The subjects of the wall paintings are the life of the Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus, and his life and death, his passion, and the resurrection. All of the painting is the work of Giotto, properly full name Giotto di Bondone. Born, we think, about 1266 or 1267, and lived until 1337. Dying, I believe, in Florence and working at the latter part of his life in Florence. There is important work by Giotto in Florence, and there are important individual pieces scattered in other places. But the Arena Chapel is unique in Giotto's oeuvre as an extraordinary, complete cycle, his work only, of an artist who was at the height of his powers. He'd already made a name for himself in Tuscany. He had been called to go to the shrine of St. Francis of Assisi in Umbria, where he had painted in the upper church there and left a number of works whose exact authenticity is somewhat doubted. Whether he or his helpers worked on certain pieces is a matter of much discussion. There is no such discussion when one looks at the Arena Chapel. The chapel measures about 69 feet long, about 26 feet wide, and 43 feet high to the vault. And it is illuminated by windows on the right side as you look at the interior, a series of tall lancet windows on that south wall, none on the north wall, which was adjacent to the palace. So just from the one side, well, this, for an artist, for a fresco painter, a muralist, was ideal. This provided a maximum of uninterrupted space for the artist to paint on. He didn't have to worry about all manner of architectural things sticking out here and there. Only the windows were a matter that he had to, in a sense, paint around. Speaking of painting around and speaking of architectural detail, you might think, as you look at this, that those bands between the scenes on the wall, between the narrative scenes, were part of the architecture. They are not. They are part of the painting. He painted them, he and his helpers as well painted those. They are a kind of artificial architectural and decorative banding to separate the scenes, both vertically and horizontally, and also the arch which you can see that crosses the ceiling. None of that is architectural. That is all painted work. How long did it take Giotto to paint this? That's hard to say, and it's possible that he worked here until 1310, that is to say from 1303, when the chapel was ready for painting, when the walls were prepared, until 1310. Some think so. Others think that he managed to do this in the remarkably short span of 2 years, so that the frescoes would have been complete by 1305 when the chapel was consecrated, and it's that consecration which causes the uncertainty about whether or not he had finished his work by that time. But whether it took 2 years or whether it took 7 years, the Arena Chapel is a work for eternity. I know that's an over-the-top statement, and that particular over-the-top statement should be understood first as an expression of the uniformly agreed upon, universally agreed upon magnificence and influence of Giotto's art here. And second, as a willful assertion on my part of the eternal life of great art. Eternal life of great art. That second assertion is, of course, untrue in the physical sense, because not only have countless works of art and literature and music disappeared from the face of the earth altogether, great works that we know about only in description now, but the Arena Chapel itself has barely escaped that fate. We have mentioned, and probably will again, the damage of the Second World War and of other wars. During the Second World War, Allied bombers, seeking industrial targets in the area near Padua, in the industrial area, under a cloud cover, dropped bombs which hit everything but, in many cases, what they thought they were going to destroy. Bombs were in the whole area, bomb craters, and the Church of the Eremitani, which is perhaps 100 yards from the Arena Chapel, with great frescoes by Mantegna, suffered a direct hit. And that was a great loss. But the absolutely catastrophic one that the destruction of Giotto's frescoes would have been is incalculable and unthinkable. Well, I'm far ahead of my story. So we must go back to the chapel, to its founder, the man who paid for it, to Giotto, and also to the medium of fresco, which I will explain at least briefly to you. Enrico Scrovegni's father was named Reginaldo, and he died in 1289. He was a wealthy and at the same time notorious citizen of Padua, because both his wealth and notoriety came from money lending at usurious rates, and usury was despised and in the eyes of the church was a sin. And so widely despised was Reginaldo Scrovegni that Dante, whose Divine Comedy was begun in 1307, reserved a place for Reginaldo for him in his fictional hell in the seventh circle, which was reserved for usurers. Enrico Scrovegni himself, the son, was probably a usurer, and he may have commissioned this chapel, I think it's likely, and its staff of priests to redeem the family reputation and perhaps to redeem their souls as well. Giotto, according to Vasari in his Lives of the Artists, written in the 16th century, was the pupil of Cimabue. This may not be true. It may be what they like to call a pious legend. But it certainly reflected their stylistic kinship. Cimabue and Giotto is a logical progression from Cimabue to Giotto. Already in his late 30s, when he was commissioned to do this work and came to Padua, Giotto had established a considerable reputation with important works in the fresco cycle at the shrine of St. Francis at Assisi, the saint's birthplace, and an enormous crucifix for the Florentine church of Santa Maria Novella, among others. He had also worked in Rome, though the work there, what remains, is tenuous and usually much remade. But we know he was called to work in Rome. Fresco. We must talk about it because it is the principal method of decorating walls in the Renaissance and for a long time thereafter. This is the principal medium of painting on walls. The word simply means fresh in Italian. And in fresco, the colors are water-based and they are painted onto a plaster wall. If they were to be painted directly onto the dry plaster wall, and they sometimes are, the result is called fresco a secco, dry fresco. If painted, on the other hand, on a thin layer of wet plaster, which has been laid on to the dry wall below it, thin layer, 3/4 of an inch, I don't know, thin layer of wet plaster, then the colors, the water-based colors, are infused is better, into the plaster, and the result is true fresco, in Italian, buon fresco. And this is one of the most permanent painting techniques because the color is part of the wall. It's a physical part of it. So if you scrape part of the surface of the fresco off, the color is still there. The dry fresco, however, if it is used, and sometimes it was used especially for finishing details or with very expensive pigments which you really couldn't afford to wash into the wall, had to spread on the surface. Those tended to be much more subject to damage and to being scraped off. And also some of those colors on the surface proved to be fugitive. Blues particularly had a tendency to disappear over time. The painting of an area of wet plaster stops when the plaster dries. You can't paint anymore when that section of plaster you've laid down dries. So the medium requires speed and confidence. It's difficult to match one day's work with the preceding day's work, especially in colors. Discrete areas of color won't match well. So it's best to do one area at a time, a whole figure or part of a figure, the head, the body, a particular whole area at one time. Because it's very easy after the passage of time, and probably not much time, to distinguish the sections. In fact, such a section of a day's work in Italian is called a day's work, a giornata, so that you can look at a wall of plaster, of fresco work, and you can see the shape of the head. And then you can see the next day's work and its shape, and each of those is a day's work, and you can know just how long it took the artist to do it. And by the way, when frescoing a wall, the painter must start at the top and work his way down, or he risks dripping a lot of paint on finished work. This is true of painting your own wall without figures on them, but when you're painting something as elaborate as a mural, you don't want that to happen. Let me, while we have this interior still with us, give you something to look at, something to say about the arrangement of the frescoes in their order. As I mentioned at the outset, the subjects of the fresco cycle are the life of the Virgin Mary and the life of Jesus. They are ordered, as you see, in 3 tiers, 3 horizontal tiers, and the story begins at the altar end. We're looking down to the far end of the chapel in this photo. The top tier on the right-hand south wall then picks up the story with the scenes of Mary's parents and continues back toward us at the entrance door where we're standing in this photograph, then continues on the top tier on the left-hand side. There's a slight cove there, as you see, curve in the wall, and it continues back from there to the altar wall. The last narrative scene on that upper tier near the altar wall is Mary's wedding procession. There are 12 scenes in all on that upper tier. The arched altar wall, and we'll be looking at it again, shows at the top God sending the angel Gabriel to tell Mary of the divine child she is to bear. And the actual Annunciation flanks the arch just here and here, with Gabriel on the left, the angel of the Annunciation, and Mary on the right. The middle tier of the right wall begins at the altar with the Nativity, the birth of Jesus, and moves through the stories of his early childhood. Then, when we get back here, it jumps across to the north side again, the left wall, and continues mostly with stories of his ministry, the public career of Jesus. The bottom tier on the south wall continues with the last events of Jesus' life, from the Last Supper to the mocking of Christ, and on here, and then jumping over to the opposite wall with the procession to Calvary and the crucifixion, and on through the events after his death, ending once more at the altar wall. The only wall that we have not mentioned or seen so far is the entrance door wall, and there Giotto painted the Last Judgment. For the remainder of this lecture and the next, we'll look more closely at some of these scenes in narrative order. Here you are with the triumphal arch with the altar below here, and I wanted you to see the entire arch here. You see the Annunciation at the top, but I wanted you to see the whole chapel here because on the altar below are two angels flanking a Madonna and Child, and that Madonna and Child is by Giovanni Pisano, whose art we have looked at. A work of 1305, approximately, ready there when the chapel was ready. It's very French. It has a great French elegance and flair and grace to it, and suggests that Giovanni had seen French Gothic sculpture, and marks again the difference between Giovanni and his father Nicola, with strong classical tendencies. Sources for the life of the Virgin and the life of Christ, and I should do this fairly quickly. It's important, I think, to know that it's not just biblical sources, because frequently these are extra biblical sources. For instance, for the life of the Virgin and her parents, for those legends, one goes to apocryphal gospels such as the Gospel of St. James the Less, or the Gospel of the so-called pseudo-Matthew. And in addition, there was the famous source, a medieval source of the 12th and 13th century, the famous Golden Legend, which supplied more inspiration. For the rest, the Gospels of the New Testament, of course, and from the Meditations on the life of Christ, which were gathered together in the late 13th century by a Franciscan monk who's known as the Pseudo Bonaventura, and he supplied a very appealing group of stories. It was nearly contemporary with Giotto, very appealing because it stressed the human, vulnerable aspect of Jesus and contained many colorful anecdotes which were appealing to painters. I want to move from here at last to the stories, to the paintings themselves. I'm showing you the Annunciation to St. Anne. Now, Joachim and Anne, the parents of Mary, had been childless, and they were quite elderly. Barrenness was considered a sign of God's disfavor, and Joachim had been expelled from the temple for this reason, and he went out forlornly into the fields to visit friends among the shepherds. In his absence, his worried wife suddenly received an angelic visitation. Here she kneels in this marvelous, effective dollhouse architecture, which has an open front so we can see it. It's like a little stage setting. The Annunciate Angel pops through the window on the right-hand side, which also effectively gives you a feeling of the interior, the reality of this interior space. She tells Anne that she will conceive and bear a child, and that the child will be named Mary. In the open porch at the left, a young woman holds a distaff, the stick that holds a bunch of wool from which thread is spun. This domestic object has a dual significance. In classical mythology, it's an attribute of one of the fates and refers to the thread of destiny being spun out. And in pictures of the Annunciation, it's an attribute of the Virgin Mary. So it's been adopted for the less commonly represented story of the Annunciation to her mother, to Anne. Joachim's sacrifice. He's forlorn. He makes his own sacrifice out in the fields on this rocky little barren trajectory with a shepherd on the left, an angel appearing to him on the right, and he makes his small sacrifice of a sheep still burning on top of the altar to God. The fire still burns, and not only does the angel appear, but look in the sky at the top center. The hand of God has appeared at the top center to signal acceptance of this offering. The landscape, miniature though it is very expressive in the direct use of diagonals and cutting a shallow space into the painting. The animals are worth looking at throughout. They always tend to be more naturalistic, and they're quite delightful and important in many aspects in these scenes of Joachim and others. Joachim had a dream. Joachim sleeps here while two of the shepherds stand nearby. The angel who appears in the sky is appearing to him in his dream, but we have to see it as well. And the angel tells Joachim of Anne's imminent unexpected fertility and the conception of Mary, and tells him to go at once to Jerusalem to meet his wife at the Golden Gate. Before we go to the Golden Gate, look at that marvelous block of a form of Joachim as he sits in sleep, wrapped in a perfectly volumetric fashion in front of the equal volume of the little shepherd shed behind him. The meeting at the Golden Gate, one of the most memorable to me and to many of the scenes of the Arena Chapel. Here are Joachim and Anna reunited, joyful in their knowledge, each having been told separately that she will conceive, and they embrace at the gate. And the gate is part of their embrace. The arch springing from the right comes over and right down to the figures. It points to them as if it needed emphasis, but it points to them, and it's an embrace. It's a real embrace. The two figures become one. They're one physical unit. Their two heads are virtually one unit with an overlapping halo. They've been accompanied, or rather she has, to the gate by some happy women, and a shepherd has accompanied Joachim from the fields, but there is this one woman in black, mysterious, strange, ominous in a way at the gate that no one has ever adequately explained, but she does make you stop for just a moment and think that there's a shadow of some sort here. But this is, in the simplest possible way, an embrace of great joy. On the north wall, I pass over the birth of the Virgin and the presentation of the Virgin in the temple, so that I can show you a wonderful sequence of 3 scenes of the courting and wedding of the Virgin. The first of those are the Virgin's suitors, who have been told to appear at the temple and present their rods at the temple. According to the Golden Legend, that medieval source of stories, when Mary was 14, she left the temple in order to receive 2 suitors for her marriage. Since she had taken a vow of virginity, the high priest sought guidance and was told in a voice that the men of marriageable age of the house of David, her tribe, should each bring a dry branch and lay it on the altar. I don't think we use the word rod, a straight, slender shoot of a bush or tree very often today, unless botanists do, but it's invariably used in the title of this picture. In any case, the suitor whose branch or rod should break into flower would be chosen as Mary's husband. Well, now, Joseph was among these, but he was elderly and felt himself unsuitable, so he declined. And he's back here at the left with a halo on, and he has not presented his rod and will not present a rod because he feels he is too old for her. So he hangs back. However, when none of the branches flowered, The voice again spoke to the priest and said, "The only man who had not presented his rod was the man who would become Mary's husband." So Joseph added his to the pile, and it did, in fact, flower. Please notice that all the suitors' heads are in a line here, with only the priest's head slightly elevated above the others. But that alignment is significant because in the next scene, the suitors suddenly kneel to give their prayer before the rods, and that great expanse of blue sky opens up. All of them have knelt, their heads are even more securely aligned, and they've left that strong, solid wall of blue sky. Consider how this blue, painted with precious azurite in dry fresco, secco, must have resonated when it was newly painted. The scene is one of high anticipation. Joseph still hides himself at the left edge of the picture. Only his halo points out his head on the side, hangs back. The pyramid, by the way, of rods and figures here by the altar, wonderful pyramidal lines of the back of the priests and others, and of the rods, is splendid formally. Giotto chooses not to show the flowering of Joseph's rod, but this moment of suspension, of held breath. And then the marriage of the Virgin. His rod has flowered. He stands, you see the flower on top of the rod, and a dove of the Holy Spirit on top of that. All rise now, so that the figures are back to their normal height. When you see this in sequence on the wall of the chapel, this standing, kneeling, standing sequence is really memorable, almost a kind of cinematic approach. You see that sweep as the blue sky momentarily floods the eye in the middle scene. Well, this is the marriage ceremony. Joseph holds the flowering branch. The Holy Spirit perches upon it as a dove, because, according to the Golden Legend, this was what the prophecy of Isaiah said. A detail of the suitors, by the way, they're not happy. The elderly man's getting the bride, and they're disappointed, and two of them may be particularly noted. The man nearest him, now in this detail, is raising his hand, and I think not in greeting, but is about to strike Joseph. He's so angry. And just behind him is a suitor who takes his worthless rod and breaks it over his raised, bent knee. This is a motif which becomes so firmly established in the iconography of this particular subject that it is used over and over by Raphael, among others. This scene is followed by a wedding procession, which is badly damaged, which concludes the early life of the Virgin. What follows is, of course, a more famous Annunciation than the one to her mother Anne, and that is the Annunciation to the Virgin Mary herself. And we see again the altar wall with God the Father at the very top. This Annunciation has not to do with barrenness, as the earlier one did. This has to do with sworn virginity and an even more miraculous conception and birth, the incarnation of Christ at the moment of the Annunciation. Although this scene is placed exactly in the narrative sequence of the chapel as we've been following it, it is also the scene immediately visible upon entering the chapel. And as the first significant act in the Christian drama of salvation, this is absolutely appropriate, for this chapel is a burial chapel for the Scrovegni family. Enrico Scrovegni undoubtedly hoped for salvation, and after years of exile in Venice, where he died, he was buried here. The top of the triumphal arch is occupied by God the Father, sending the Archangel Gabriel to earth to bring the news to Mary, and the areas left and right of the arch, as I pointed out before, are inhabited by Gabriel here on the left, and Mary, each in a little room, really, on the right. This is not Giotto's invention, to have the Annunciation span the arch. It's a pre-established composition found elsewhere, and it's a brilliant conception. Each of these figures here inhabits this painted architectural room, but they're both separated and united by this arch of spiritual triumph. The curve of the arch itself carries the divine message from announcer to annunciate. In our next lecture on the Arena Chapel, we will continue our exploration, this time with the scenes, the frescoes of the life of Christ in which Giotto's interpretations of the subject seem to grow at the same time ever more human and ever more spiritual. Thank you for your attention.